She was just a 40-year-old woman in a worn-out PT shirt. To a trio of cocky reservists, she was a joke. They didn't know the faded tape on her wrist wasn't for support, it was to hide a history written in fire. The sun hadn't yet burned the morning chill from the air when Sergeant Lorna Briggs stepped through the heavy double doors of Building 9. The Joint Base Gym at Fort Brennan smelled of a sharp, sterile trinity, industrial disinfectant, old sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. It was a scent she knew better than any perfume, the signature cocktail of every military fitness facility from Bragg to Benning. Overhead, long fluorescent tubes hummed a low, incessant drone, casting everything in a harsh, clinical white light that had a knack for making people look like caricatures of themselves, either too young and untested or ancient and worn down, but never quite right. At 42, Briggs moved with a deliberate economy of motion that 2 decades in uniform had forged into her very being. Each step was purposeful, each glance an assessment. Her light brown hair was pulled back not in a simple ponytail, but into a tight, intricate French braid that clung to her scalp, a style chosen for function over fashion, ensuring nothing would come loose. She wore a standard-issue PT t-shirt, the Army logo so faded from 1,000 washes it was now just a ghostly gray smear. On the sleeve, barely visible, was the ghost of a patch from a Best Ranger competition held years ago, a quiet, overlooked clue. Her boots, scuffed and worn, were not for inspection but for action, the leather molded by miles of unforgiving terrain that didn't exist on any training map. She carried herself with a stillness that set her apart from the weekend warriors and fresh-faced recruits who typically populated the gym at this hour. There was no swagger, no chest-puffing bravado. Her presence was a quiet fact, not an announcement, the silent confidence of someone who had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was almost always the one with the least to say. Behind the front desk, Corporal Martinez was lost in the blue glow of his tablet, his fingers swiping through a digital roster with the bored efficiency of a man pulling a thankless weekend shift. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, slanted through the grimy, high windows. In the distance, a radio crackled with the staccato rhythm of morning duty assignments. Sign-ins on the iris scanner, Martinez mumbled, gesturing with his chin toward a futuristic-looking but clearly well-used device mounted on the wall. Look in, wait for the green light. Briggs stepped up, her posture perfect, and leaned into the scanner. A small red light tracked her eye, flickered, and then a soft chime was followed by a steady, permissive green. Martinez's eyes, drawn by the chime, flickered to his screen. He did a double take at the name that appeared, Briggs, Lorna. He squinted, the name triggering a faint, distant bell in the archives of his memory, something from a mandatory briefing he'd half-slept through. You on the sparring roster, Sergeant? He asked, a note of professional skepticism coloring his tone. It was unusual for someone of her apparent age and rank, who wasn't a known combatives instructor, to be signing in for live sparring. Was told I was cleared for it, she replied. Her voice was level, a simple statement of fact. It carried no defensiveness, no aggression. It was the tone of a pilot confirming their flight plan. Martinez scrolled through his screen again, found no red flags or restrictions, and shrugged. The system said yes, so it wasn't his problem. Main floor is open. Equipment checkout is on the left if you need anything. She gave a single, sharp nod and walked through the security gate. The only sound she made was the soft, rhythmic squeak of her boots on the polished concrete, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the ambient hum of a military base waking to life. Inside, near the gleaming chrome of the weight bench, a different kind of energy festered. 3 reservists, all in their late 20s, were clustered together in a loose triangle of casual contempt. Spence, the unspoken leader, had the chiseled, gym-sculpted physique of a man who equated muscle mass with authority. Toiver was leaner, with a perpetually smirking expression that served as his primary mode of communication. And Darren, the quietest of the 3, watched his companions with the eager-to-please look of someone who desperately wanted to belong to their club. Spence caught sight of Briggs first, his eyes tracking her with the lazy interest of a predator searching for easy prey to amuse himself. Well, he murmured to the others, his voice low but carrying. check it out. Looks like someone's mom got lost on her way to the commissary. Toivo grinned, a flash of white teeth. Nah, man, that's got to be logistics. Look at the sleeves. Bet she files reports about our push-ups instead of actually doing them. Darren, not wanting to be left out, snorted as he lifted a dumbbell with more grunt than effort. Total paper soldier vibes, he added, parroting a term he'd heard others use. Probably has a certificate for typing speed hanging in her cubicle. The trio shared a low, rumbling laugh, the easy, dismissive sound of men who believe themselves to be the alpha predators of this particular jungle, secure in their shared assumptions and confident that no one important was listening. The men's laughter, sharp and ugly, echoed off the high ceiling, but Briggs gave no indication she'd heard it. She set her duffel bag down in a corner, out of the way, and unzipped it with the same methodical precision she brought to every task. Her movements were fluid, wasting no energy. From the bag, she pulled out a pair of hand wraps. They weren't fancy, not the brightly colored, branded gear the reservists favored. They were plain black cloth, worn soft and pliable from years of use, stained with the faint, ghostly memories of sweat and effort. She sat on a low bench and began wrapping her wrists. It was a ritual. Each loop and tuck was executed with an automaticity that spoke of thousands of repetitions, a muscle memory so deeply ingrained she could have done it perfectly in pitch darkness. As she worked, the long compression sleeve on her right forearm, a simple black tube of fabric, shifted just enough. For a fleeting second, a glimpse of the skin beneath was visible. It wasn't the smooth, unblemished skin of an office worker. It was marked. Not with the vibrant ink of a tattoo, but with something starker. Thin, vertical lines, precise and uniform, were seared into her flesh, scars that spoke of permanence and a purpose far removed from decoration. Spence, ever watchful for a new angle of attack, noticed the motion. His eyes narrowed, trying to process the incongruous image. He decided to press his advantage. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice dripping with manufactured friendliness, a tone designed to be both a greeting and an insult. "You know this isn't the senior center fitness class, right? We actually hit things here." Briggs didn't look up. She continued her rap, pulling the fabric taut over her knuckles. "Good thing," she said, her voice quiet but cutting through the gym's ambient noise with surprising clarity. "Those are usually too easy." Toivo let out a bark of a laugh, though it lacked the genuine amusement of his earlier jokes. "Okay, that's cute. But for real, this is a combatives rotation. A little more intense than your Tuesday morning water aerobics." He was trying to regain control of the narrative, to put her back in the box they'd built for her. She finished her left wrist, securing the Velcro with a firm press, and started on her right. Her movements remained automatic, precise, unhurried. "I wasn't planning on sitting down." The response hung in the air, a small, dense pocket of tension. The three men exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't following the script. The woman who was supposed to be flustered or intimidated was instead meeting their condescension with a calm, unyielding wall. The entertainment was beginning to feel like work. Darren, feeling the initiative slipping, tried to reclaim it. He stepped forward, adopting a swagger that was slightly too exaggerated to be natural. "Look, lady, no disrespect," he began, the phrase itself a profound act of disrespect, "but you might be in over your head. This isn't exactly beginner's night at the YMCA." For the first time since entering their orbit, Briggs looked up. She paused her rapping and met Darren's gaze. Her eyes, a pale, steady blue, were unblinking. It wasn't an aggressive stare, but it was profoundly unsettling. It was the gaze of someone who had seen true danger, and he was not it. In that moment, Darren was suddenly, acutely aware of how young and foolish he sounded. "Then it should be interesting," she said. As she adjusted the wrap on her right wrist, the compression sleeve slipped again, this time more significantly. It revealed a larger section of her forearm. The marks were clearer now. They weren't random. A series of 9 vertical lines, each identical in length and spacing, burned into the skin with what looked like surgical precision. Darren saw them clearly and felt a cold knot form in the pit of his stomach. It was just weird. "What's with the wrist art?" he asked, trying to inject sarcasm into his voice, but it came out small and thin. Toiver leaned in, his expression shifting from amusement to a kind of morbid curiosity. "It's a kill count," he said, the joke falling flat the moment it left his lips. He tried to recover. "What, you watch too much Netflix and decide to give yourself some prison tats for street cred?" Briggs finished her rap and stood up. Her movements were a single, fluid motion. She looked at the 3 of them, a patient, analytical expression on her face, as if she were assessing a piece of faulty equipment. The look made them all realize, simultaneously, that they were in the middle of something they did not understand. "Let me know when you want to find out what they really mean," she said, turning toward the sparring mats. Her calm confidence left no room for argument. They were still laughing as she walked away, but the sound had changed. It was smaller now, brittle and uncertain, like the sound of men whistling past a graveyard they suddenly realized they might have to walk through. The sparring area dominated the center of the gym, a wide expanse of clean, regulation mats taped down with military precision. The morning light, now stronger, streamed through the high windows, illuminating the space with an honest, unforgiving clarity. Staff Sergeant Delaney, the gym coordinator, emerged from the equipment room. Built like a fire hydrant, short, solid, and immovable, he carried his ever-present clipboard like a scepter. Delaney had seen every type of soldier in his 3 years running this gym, from green recruits convinced of their immortality to grizzled veterans who moved like ghosts. He had a sixth sense for trouble. Opening live sparring rotation, he called out, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the clank of weights. "Sign-ups on the board. Light contact only. Respect rank and regulations. Anyone who can't follow those rules can find another place to work out their issues." Briggs walked over to the sign-up board and wrote her name at the top of the list. Her handwriting was neat, precise block lettering, the kind developed over years of filling out forms in less than ideal conditions. Delaney glanced at the name and raised a thick eyebrow. "You're cleared for this, Sergeant?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. There was no arrogance in her voice, just absolute certainty. Spence had swaggered over, peering at the board. "She actually signed up," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and glee. He saw this as a public spectacle, a chance to put the old woman in her place. "This is gonna be good." Briggs turned to face him, her expression still calm but now holding a flicker of anticipation. "You're welcome to test whatever theories you've been developing," she said. The challenge was quiet, delivered without heat, but it landed with the force of a thrown gauntlet. Spence's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "All right, Grandma," he said, the nickname sounding less clever and more desperate now. "Let's see what you've got." They squared off in the center of the mat. The difference between them was a study in contrasts. Spence was a whirlwind of motion, bouncing on his toes, rolling his shoulders, a flurry of flashy stretches learned from action movies. He was all wasted energy, a peacock displaying its feathers. Briggs, in contrast, was a portrait of stillness. She simply stood there, relaxed but ready, her weight perfectly balanced, her hands loose at her sides. She was a coiled spring, exuding a quiet potential for violence that was far more intimidating than Spence's performative aggression. Delaney set the timer. "Go easy on her, Spence," Toiver called from the sidelines, still committed to the joke. The buzzer sounded. For the first 30 seconds, Spence danced around her, throwing light, testing jabs. He was trying to gauge her reactions, to find an opening. But Briggs gave him nothing. She didn't flinch or retreat. She simply tracked his movements, her eyes cataloging every feint, every shift of his weight. Her feet made tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments, keeping her in a position of optimal advantage. Frustrated by her passivity, Spence decided to commit. He launched a quick, powerful right hook, a punch meant to demonstrate his speed and end the exchange. The response was so swift and economical that it was hard to follow. Briggs didn't block the punch in a conventional way. Instead, she swayed back just enough for the punch to miss by a millimeter, and in the same fluid motion, she stepped inside his extended arm. She pivoted on her left foot, her hip connecting with his, and used his own forward momentum to execute a perfect ogashi, a major hip throw. One moment, Spence was the aggressor, confident and in control. The next, he was airborne, a look of pure shock on his face as the world flipped upside down. He hit the mat hard. The impact made a sound like a side of beef being dropped on concrete, a wet, heavy thud that echoed across the suddenly silent gym. The air rushed from his lungs in a pained gasp. Toiver and Darren stared, their jaws slack. Delaney stopped making notes on his clipboard. Spence lay on the mat for a long moment, the white light swimming above him as he tried to process what had just happened. When he finally pushed himself to his feet, the grin was gone, replaced by a mask of humiliated fury. "Okay," he wheezed, his voice hoarse. "Lucky shot." But the words were hollow. Nothing about that felt like luck. It felt like physics, like geometry, like a problem he didn't even know he was supposed to solve. The timer reset. This time, Spence was more cautious. He abandoned the flashy jabs and opted for brute force, launching a shoulder charge designed to overwhelm her with his superior size and strength. It was a novice's mistake. Briggs didn't try to meet his force head-on. She simply sidestepped the clumsy charge, her movement as effortless as a matador avoiding a bull. As he blundered past, she hooked his leading leg with her foot. It was a small, subtle movement, but it was enough to shatter his balance. He went down again, this time sprawling forward. Before he could even think to recover, she was on him. In a seamless transition, she flowed onto his back, her knee pressing firmly between his shoulder blades, and expertly snaked her arm under his chin, locking in a perfect rear naked choke. His wrist was twisted at an angle that sent a jolt of fire up his shoulder. It wasn't violent or messy. It was clinically precise. "Tap," she said, her voice as calm and conversational as if she were asking for the time. For a moment, his pride warred with the rapidly depleting oxygen in his brain. The world began to shrink to a dark tunnel. He slapped the mat frantically with his free hand. 1, 2, 3 times. She released him instantly, stepping back to give him space. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. Spence sat up, gasping for air, rubbing his neck and working his shoulder. He stared at the woman now standing calmly at the edge of the mat, taking a sip of water, her breathing steady and even. He looked at his friends, who were staring at him with a mixture of pity and awe. The lesson had begun, but the final exam was yet to come. The main door to the gym opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, a sound that cut through the thick, tense silence that had fallen over the sparring area. Major Kendall Hayes stepped inside. At 54, he moved with the controlled, purposeful gait of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the complex machinery of the military, much of it in places that didn't offer guided tours. His uniform was crisp but functional, the creases sharp from habit, not ceremony. He held a digital tablet, his face illuminated by its soft glow as he made his morning rounds, fitness compliance, personnel readiness, the endless stream of data that kept the base humming. Hayes paused just inside the doorway, his experienced eyes immediately sensing that the room's atmosphere was off-kilter. The usual morning soundtrack of grunts, clanking weights, and motivational rock music was muted. In its place was a palpable tension, a shared, unspoken question hanging in the air. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the scene. Near the water cooler, Spence sat with a towel draped around his neck, gingerly working a shoulder that was clearly new to that particular kind of pain. Toiver and Darren leaned against a wall, their earlier swagger completely deflated, replaced by a sullen watchfulness. And on the mat, a woman sat calmly adjusting her wrist wraps, her focus so absolute she seemed to be in a world of her own. Hayes walked over to Delaney, who was staring at his own clipboard as if the letters had rearranged themselves into an unsolvable riddle. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked. His voice was quiet but carried an innate authority that commanded attention. Delaney handed him the physical sign-up sheet without looking up. "Had an unscheduled addition to the sparring roster, sir. Woman signed herself in. Said she was cleared." Hayes took the board. His eyes scanned the list, his finger tracing down the names. He stopped when he reached the neat block lettering at the top, Briggs, Lorna. His expression, usually a carefully controlled mask of professionalism, shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a subtle compression of his lips. It was the look of a historian who had just found a living artifact from a forgotten, bloody era. "Briggs," he said, the name a soft exhalation, a question and a statement in one. "Yeah," Delaney confirmed. He finally looked at the major. "You know her, sir?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. His gaze lifted from the clipboard and fixed on the woman on the mat. He studied her with the focused intensity a bomb technician reserves for a suspicious package. She was pulling back one of her wrist wraps, readjusting the tension after the spar. As she did, her black compression sleeve slid down her forearm. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. Under the harsh, honest light of the gym, the marks were fully exposed. 9 vertical lines. Burned into the skin with surgical precision. Each one identical in length, width, and spacing. They were not the chaotic scars of an accident, nor the stylized marks of a tattoo artist. They were a record. A ledger. Hayes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd seen marks like that before, not in person, but in the appendices of the most highly classified after-action reports, documents that officially didn't exist. They belonged to a different time, a different kind of war, fought by units operating under a set of rules written in blood, not ink. They were the signature of a ghost. Toiver, still struggling to process his friend's humiliation and desperate to regain some semblance of control, saw the major's focus and decided to offer his own ignorant analysis. "She's got those things all over her arms, sir," he called across the room, his voice laced with forced bravado. "Real dramatic. Like she's some kind of warrior priestess wannabe from a bad movie." The words hit the air and died, smothered by the sudden, crushing weight of Major Hayes's full attention. When the major finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, a blade cutting through the silence. "Do you boys," he said, his gaze sweeping over the 3 of them, "have any idea what you're looking at?" The question was not rhetorical. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand between knowledge and ignorance. Toiver blinked, a flicker of fear finally dawning in his eyes. He had wandered far off his map and into uncharted territory. Hayes didn't wait for an answer. He began walking toward Briggs, his steps deliberate and imbued with a respect that was utterly at odds with the morning's events. Major Hayes stopped a respectful distance from the sparring mat. Briggs looked up, her expression unreadable, as he approached. The 2 officers regarded each other for a long moment, a silent exchange passing between them that no one else in the room could decipher. "Mind if I ask where you're stationed these days, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, his tone one of professional courtesy. "Off the grid, sir," she replied, her voice steady. Civilian contractor status was reinstated 8 months ago. It was a coded answer, providing information only to those cleared to understand it. Hayes nodded slowly, pieces of a complex and dangerous puzzle falling into place in his mind. "They finally cleared your paperwork, then?" "Enough to walk back through doors like this one," she said, with a slight gesture to the gym around them. It was a statement about bureaucracy, not pride. He turned back to face the 3 reservists, who were now watching this exchange with a growing sense of dread. The casual, testosterone-fueled atmosphere of their morning had been systematically dismantled and replaced by something heavy, serious, and far beyond their comprehension. "Those marks you've been joking about," Hayes began, his voice carrying easily across the room, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of absolute authority. They are not decoration. They are not some tough guy accessory you pick up at a tattoo parlor on a weekend pass. He paused, letting his words sink in, forcing them to confront the reality of their ignorance. Each one of those lines, he continued, gesturing toward Briggs's arm, represents a confirmed elimination on a mission that never officially happened. That isn't ink, son. That is cauterized flesh. Scar tissue. It's how certain echo-designated teams used to mark their logs when operating in environments where traditional methods were impossible. Tattoos can get infected. A blade can heal. But a heated piece of metal, applied with precision, leaves a permanent, sterile record that will survive anything. The gym had fallen utterly silent. The distant clank of weights had ceased. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to have receded, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Toiver's face had gone the color of chalk. "Wait, like, actual combat," he stammered. Hayes fixed him with a look of cold pity. "No," he said, his voice laced with dry irony. "Like actual war. The kind you don't come home from if you make a mistake. The kind that isn't fought for flags or headlines, but for information, in the dark, where no one can hear you scream." He pointed a finger, not at Briggs, but toward the memory her scars represented. Sergeant Briggs ran point for the 3rd Reconnaissance Group. Deep insertion, non-attributed operations. You know what that means. It means if she and her team were caught or killed, the United States government would deny they ever existed. They were ghosts. Black budget missions in countries that don't appear on your training maps. He took a breath, his gaze sweeping over the 3 men, who now looked like chastened schoolboys. 9, he said, the word landing like a physical blow. 9 confirmed kills that we know about. That's 9 individuals who were breathing when she encountered them and were not when she left. And that's just the ones that were officially documented in reports that were later burned. Spence, the arrogant leader, the man who had initiated the mockery, was staring at his own hands, which suddenly seemed soft, useless, and childish. You think they let her just walk in here and sign up for a sparring match because they're feeling nostalgic? Hayes pressed on, his voice rising slightly. She's here for a recertification that is so far above your pay grade you can't even conceive of it. This woman has more confirmed enemy kills on her record than most active infantry companies see in an entire deployment. He let that final, devastating fact settle in the silence. The woman you've been calling Grandma and Paper Soldier, he said, his voice dropping back to a quiet, lethal intensity, has more combat experience in one of her little fingers than the 3 of you combined will accumulate in your entire military careers. Even if you each serve for 20 years and see action in every major conflict between now and your retirement. During this entire explanation, Briggs had remained silent. She hadn't nodded in confirmation or shown any sign of satisfaction. She simply finished packing her gear back into her duffel bag, her movements as calm and methodical as ever. Her silence, her utter lack of need for validation, was more damning than any boast could ever have been. Darren, the most hesitant of the trio, finally found his voice, though it came out as a pathetic whisper. We didn't know." "No," Hayes agreed, his expression softening slightly from anger to a weary disappointment. "You didn't. And that is the first real lesson you've learned today." The door to the gym had not yet hissed shut behind Major Hayes when the silence became unbearable. It pressed in on the 3 reservists, a physical weight of shame and newfound understanding. Spence, Toiver, and Darren stood frozen in a tableau of disgrace, the polished floor of the sparring mat suddenly feeling like the world's most judgmental stage. The casual camaraderie they had shared an hour ago had evaporated, replaced by a chasm of individual humiliation. Briggs shouldered her duffel bag. It settled on her with familiar weight. She gave Major Hayes a short, professional nod. "Still sharp, Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice now holding only respect. Briggs looked back at him, and for the first time that morning, the faint ghost of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it was genuine. "Rust was never the problem, sir," she said. And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who had just been given a masterclass on assumptions, respect, and the vast, often invisible, difference between playing a soldier and being a warrior. Hayes watched her go, then turned his attention back to the three young men. He wasn't angry anymore. He just looked tired, as if he'd had this conversation 1,000 times before. "You're going to remember this morning for a long, long time," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "The question is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to learn from it? Or are you just going to file it away as an embarrassing story you get drunk and laugh about 10 years from now?" He tucked his tablet under his arm. "In this line of work, you never, ever know who you're talking to. That clerk who processes your pay might be a former ranger who took a desk job after his third tour. That mechanic working on your Humvee might have survived 2 IED blasts in Afghanistan. And that quiet, middle-aged woman minding her own business in the gym," he let the sentence hang in the air, its meaning now crushingly clear. "Remember Sergeant Briggs. Remember those marks. And remember that the most dangerous people are almost always the ones who don't feel the need to tell you how dangerous they are." He turned and left without another word. The pneumatic hiss of the door closing was the only sound. For a long minute, the three men just stood there. Finally, Spence, his face pale and drawn, sank onto a bench and put his head in his hands. "I'm such an idiot," he muttered into his palms. Toiver, for once, had no witty retort. He just stared at the spot where Briggs had stood, his mouth slightly agape. "9, he whispered to no one in particular. "She didn't even break a sweat." Darren leaned against the wall, looking physically ill. He felt the cold shame of his own complicity wash over him. He had known, somewhere deep down, that they were being cruel, but he had gone along with it to fit in. The lesson hit him the hardest. It wasn't just about underestimating an opponent, it was about a fundamental failure of character. Outside, the sun was higher now, bright and warm. Lorna Briggs walked across the vast asphalt parking lot, her shadow long behind her. She didn't look back at Building 9. The lesson had been delivered. Whether it was learned was now up to them. Some lessons were like that. You could lead a horse to water, but you couldn't make it think. But you could make damn sure it remembered the moment it realized it was dying of thirst. She reached her vehicle. It wasn't a sleek, modern SUV or a souped-up sports car. It was a 20-year-old Ford Ranger, its blue paint faded and chipped, a small crack spiderwebbing across the corner of the windshield. It was the truck of a person who needed a tool, not a trophy. She tossed her duffel onto the passenger seat, climbed in, and turned the key. The old engine turned over with a familiar, reliable rumble. As she pulled out of the parking spot and headed for the main gate, she was just another contractor, another face in the crowd, disappearing back into the quiet anonymity she had earned the hard way. Have you ever met someone you completely misjudged? Someone who turned out to be carrying a history you couldn't possibly have imagined? Let us know in the comments below, but please, as we've all learned today, comment with respect. If this story reminded you that true strength often runs silent and deep, hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss our next story about the hidden heroes who walk among us every single day. Share this video with someone who thinks they know what a warrior looks like. And check out our playlist for more powerful stories just like this one. We'll see you next time.